What if the most dangerous thing a man could do wasn't fly into enemy airspace, but sit across from a stranger in a cafe and pretend to be someone he wasn't? In 1963, the Soviet Union had given the Arab world a weapon that kept Israeli generals awake at night. Not a missile, not a tank, a fighter jet. The MiG-21, the most advanced supersonic interceptor ever built, and Israel had no idea what it could actually do. They had rumors, they had secondhand reports, they had nothing they could trust. So Mossad sent a man who didn't exist to Baghdad to find out. His name was George Bacon, and from the moment he landed in Iraq, every word out of his mouth was a lie. There is a version of this story where a brave pilot flies to freedom and the West cheers in secret rooms. That version is real, but it leaves out the part where a man named George Bacon sat across from an Iraqi Air Force officer for months, performing a character he had rehearsed until it felt like skin, knowing that one wrong answer, one slipped detail, one moment of recognition on the wrong face, and he would not be going home. It leaves out the 3 pilots who came before, the ones who said no. What happened to them is not something this story will rush past. It leaves out the 43 family members who had to vanish from Baghdad without appearing to vanish. And it leaves out what Munir Redfa became after he gave Mossad everything they wanted, because what a man becomes after a story like this is never what the story promises him he will be. This is Operation Diamond, and it starts not with a jet and not with a pilot. It starts with a stranger on a park bench in Paris, offering to sell something that should have been impossible to sell. Paris, 1963. A man walked into a building that did not officially conduct intelligence work and asked to speak with someone he couldn't name about something he couldn't say out loud in public. His name was Salman. No one, to this day, knows exactly who he worked for, who sent him, or what he expected to gain. What Salman said was this: he could arrange the physical delivery of a fully operational MiG-21 fighter jet to Israel. The price was $1 million. His instructions were 3 sentences long. Send an operative to Baghdad, call a specific phone number, ask for a man named Joseph. That was it. No timeline, no guarantee, no proof that any of it was real. The senior Mossad officer who received this offer had every reason to dismiss it as a trap. The MiG-21 was the most protected piece of military hardware the Soviet Union had ever produced. Moscow guarded its technical specifications so tightly that even Warsaw Pact allies flew modified, downgraded versions. The idea that a stranger with a phone number could arrange its delivery was not just unlikely. It was the exact kind of offer a counterintelligence service designs to draw out enemy operatives. Mossad Chief Mir Amit was not a man who dismissed things without examination. He had taken command in March 1963, inheriting an organization that needed rebuilding. He was precise, methodical, and he had one habit his subordinates remembered clearly: he asked the question everyone else avoided. The question he asked about Salman's offer was quiet and specific. What if it's real? He already knew what the Israeli Air Force needed. The commander had told him directly. Arab nations surrounding Israel were being equipped with MiG-21s. Israeli pilots were flying French Mirages, excellent aircraft, but built without knowledge of what they would be facing in actual combat. Performance curves, radar signatures, weapons systems, cockpit blind spots, and none of it was known. All of it would matter the moment a war started. "If you bring me a MiG-21," the Air Force commander told Amit, "you will have done a good day's work." Amit approved a contact mission to Baghdad. The operative deployed under the cover name George Bacon was not traveling as an intelligence officer. He was traveling as a European businessman, a man with a documented professional history, a plausible reason to be in Iraq, and no visible connection to Tel Aviv. His legend, the false identity built around him by Mossad's technical division, was thorough in every verifiable detail. But no forged document solves the problem of a room full of people who are professionally trained to notice when something is slightly wrong about another person. Baghdad in 1963 was not a city where a European businessman could move without being watched. Iraq's intelligence service, the Mukhabarat, was not sophisticated by the standards of Western agencies, but it was present, it was motivated, and it operated on a principle that required very little evidence before deciding someone was a problem. Being identified as Israeli in Iraq was not an embarrassment, it was a death sentence. George Bacon called the number. He asked for Joseph. He was directed to a park bench near the Euphrates River, where he sat down in the late afternoon next to an elderly man who looked like nobody important. Joseph was a Maronite Christian. He was not trained in intelligence. He was not ideological. He was a man who had decided, for reasons he kept to himself, that he was willing to help. And he had something that made him useful in a way no amount of tradecraft could manufacture from scratch. He had a nephew who flew MiG-21s for the Iraqi Air Force. The nephew's name was Munir Redfa. Captain Munir Redfa was born in 1934 into Iraq's Syriac Christian minority, one of the oldest communities in the region, present in Mesopotamia for 2,000 years, and by 1963 deeply accustomed to a specific kind of treatment. Tolerated, occasionally valued, never fully trusted. Redfa was a gifted pilot. He had worked hard, risen through a system that did not make it easy for him, and earned the right to fly the MiG-21, an honor the Sunni Arab officer class granted reluctantly. He was skilled enough to be useful. He was Christian enough to be watched. The discrimination was not occasional, it was structural. It showed up in briefings, in promotions, in the way senior officers spoke to him and around him. Redfa had spent years absorbing it with the discipline of a professional who had nowhere else to put it. But Mossad did not approach him because he was angry. They approached him because of what he had been ordered to do. In 1963 and into 1964, the Iraqi government was conducting military operations against Kurdish rebels in the north of the country. Redfa was assigned combat sorties, bombing runs over Kurdish villages, civilian targets, areas where the people on the ground had no air defense and no ability to fight back. He flew the missions. He followed orders. What his superiors could not see, and what George Bacon's network was beginning to understand through careful patient intelligence gathered through Joseph, was that the missions were doing something to Redfa. Something quiet, accumulating, and irreversible. At this stage, Operation Diamond was not a recruitment operation. That detail matters. George Bacon was not yet trying to convince Redfa of anything. He was watching, through Joseph, through threads extended carefully over months, to understand what kind of man Munir Redfa actually was beneath the rank and the uniform and the cockpit. Because the first rule of any operation built on deception is one that never gets written in the official histories. You do not run a cover story against a target until you know what the target needs to believe. Redfa was not the first pilot on Mossad's list. He was the fourth. What happened to the 3 pilots before him is documented in fragments: an arrest, a recruitment attempt in America that collapsed, a man who said no and was later found shot dead in a Baghdad bar during a power outage on June 15, 1965. Iraq's investigation into that death concluded it bore the signs of a foreign intelligence service. Mossad never confirmed it, never denied it. What it meant, in the operational logic of the program, was that by the time George Bacon began working his way toward Munir Redfa, the offer on the table was not simply generous. It carried a context, a weight, a suggestion that had never been spoken aloud and never needed to be. And so the question that George Bacon now had to answer, sitting in Baghdad, inside a cover identity he maintained every waking hour, was not whether Munir Redfa could be approached. The question was whether Redfa would say yes because he wanted to, or because he understood what saying no had cost the others, and whether, in the end, there was any difference between those two things at all. George Bacon's first real conversation with Munir Redfa did not happen in a safe house. It did not happen in a hotel room swept for listening devices. It happened somewhere ordinary, a place where 2 men could occupy the same space without explanation, where a European businessman and an Iraqi Air Force pilot could exist in the same frame without the frame attracting attention. We do not know the exact date. We do not know the exact location. What the operational record tells us is that by early 1965, the contact had been made. The introduction had been completed through Joseph's careful facilitation, and George Bacon was now in the business of becoming Munir Redfa's friend. Not his handler, not his recruiter, his friend. This is a distinction that intelligence professionals understand and that almost nobody else does. A handler asks for things. A friend receives things. A handler creates obligation. A friend creates trust. And trust, in an operation built entirely on deception, is the most dangerous substance in the room, because it is real on one side of the table and fabricated on the other, and the person it is real for cannot tell the difference. Bacon was careful. He did not move fast. He listened more than he spoke, which is both good tradecraft and, if you do it well enough, genuinely disarming. He asked Redfa questions about flying, the kind of questions a curious civilian asks a pilot, questions that had no intelligence value but demonstrated attention, interest, the particular quality of listening that makes a person feel seen. Redfa talked, not about classified matters, not at first. He talked about what it felt like to push a MiG-21 through the sound barrier, about the specific physical sensation of a supersonic climb, about the gap between what the aircraft could do and what most pilots had the nerve to ask of it. Bacon listened, and inside that listening, he was building a map, not of the aircraft's capabilities, not yet, but of the man. Where the pressure points were, where the grievances lived, what Redfa reached for when he wanted to feel like himself. The Kurdish missions came up eventually. Not because Bacon steered the conversation there, steering was too visible, too risky, but because they were the thing that Redfa could not leave alone. He circled back to them in the way a person returns to a bruise, pressing it to confirm it still hurts. He had followed orders. He said this with the flatness of someone who had said it to himself many times, and still found it insufficient. He had followed orders, and the orders had been legal under Iraqi military code, and the targets had been designated by his superiors, and none of that had produced anything resembling peace about what he had seen from the cockpit over those northern villages. Bacon did not exploit this. That is the part that makes the deception so complete and so difficult to categorize morally. He did not lean in. He did not offer absolution or stoke the guilt. He simply confirmed, with a stillness that read as genuine human decency, that what Redfa was describing sounded genuinely hard. That response, that restraint, did more for the operation than any rehearsed recruitment pitch ever could have, because Redfa was not looking for someone to use his pain. He had plenty of people in his life who had done that. He was looking for someone who could sit with it without flinching and without agenda. George Bacon gave him that. And George Bacon did not exist. By mid-1965, Mossad's assessment in Tel Aviv had shifted. The surveillance operation had graduated. Redfa was ready to be approached, not with the full offer, not yet, but with a careful first step. A probe, designed to see how Redfa responded to the suggestion that his situation did not have to remain permanent. The probe was simple. Bacon, during a conversation, mentioned, casually, in the middle of something else, that he had contacts who could help people in difficult professional situations, people who felt their abilities were being wasted, people who might benefit from a different kind of opportunity. Redfa heard this, let a silence pass, then changed the subject. Bacon reported back, not yet, but not closed. Here is where the first assumption from Phase 1 breaks apart. The assumption, built into the operation's original architecture, was that Redfa's grievances, the discrimination, the Kurdish missions, the professional ceiling imposed by his religion, were strong enough to make him receptive. That the combination of moral injury and personal frustration had created a man primed for recruitment. That assumption was true, but it was true in a way that created a problem no one in Tel Aviv had fully modeled. Redfa was not naive about what was being offered. He was a military intelligence professional at some level, Not in the clandestine sense, but in the way that any officer trained to assess threats develops a sensitivity to approaches that don't quite fit their stated purpose. He had, at some point in the months of friendship with George Bacon, begun to understand that his new European friend was not entirely what he presented himself to be. He had not acted on this understanding. He had not reported it. He had not confronted Bacon directly. He had simply noted it and continued the relationship. This created a situation that the operation had no contingency for. A target who was aware, at some level, that he was a target and who was choosing not to resist. The question this raised, which nobody in the operation could answer with confidence, was why. There was a discussion in Tel Aviv. Not a formal abort review, but something close to it. The officer overseeing the Redfa track laid out the problem plainly. If Redfa had identified Bacon as an intelligence operative and had chosen not to report him, there were two possible explanations. The first was that Redfa was genuinely interested in defecting and was waiting for the offer to become explicit. The second was that Redfa had reported Bacon to the Mukhabarat, and the Mukhabarat was allowing the relationship to continue in order to map the full scope of the operation before acting. The second scenario was not paranoia. It was standard counterintelligence practice. You do not arrest the contact operative when you can learn more by watching him. You let him work, you follow the threads, and then, when the network is fully visible, you close it all at once. If that was what was happening, George Bacon was already a dead man walking. He simply didn't know it yet. The recommendation from the officer was a temporary suspension of direct contact. Pull Bacon back. Assess through secondary sources whether Redfa had made contact with the Mukhabarat. Wait. Mir Ahmet heard this recommendation and did not immediately reject it. He sat with it for what people who were in the room later described as an unusually long silence. Then he asked one question. If we pull back now, do we ever get another access point like this? The answer was no. Amit said continue, but he said it in a way that made clear he understood the cost of being wrong. Bacon returned to contact. Redfa, when they met again, behaved exactly as he had before. Warm, trusting, open about his frustrations. No sign of surveillance, no sign of distance, no sign that anything had changed. Which was, if you were thinking carefully, not reassuring. It was exactly how someone would behave if they had been instructed to behave normally. Bacon made the full approach. He told Redfa, in language that was careful and deniable and precise, that he represented people who were very interested in speaking with him about a professional opportunity that could change his life entirely. That there would be money, significant money, in a place where it could not be touched by anyone in Baghdad. That there would be safety, that there would be a future that looked nothing like the one currently in front of him. He did not say Israel, not yet. Redfa listened, did not speak for a long moment. Then he said, I need to know what happens to my family. This was not the response Bacon had been briefed to expect. The briefing had anticipated either acceptance, refusal, or a request for time. A question about family logistics, specific, immediate, structural, suggested a man who was not deciding whether to defect. It suggested a man who had already decided and was now doing threat assessment. Bacon had no authorized answer. Family extraction had been discussed theoretically in Tel Aviv, but no operational plan existed. No routes, no safe houses, no Kurdish networks activated, no timeline. He told Redfa he would find out. He flew back to Tel Aviv, and here is the reframe. The one that changes the shape of everything that came before. The internal debrief that followed Bacon's return revealed something that had been sitting in the intelligence picture for months without anyone naming it directly. Redfa had not been deceived into trusting George Bacon. He had chosen to trust him, fully aware, or at least partially aware, that Bacon was not who he said he was. Redfa had made a calculation of his own, one that Mossad had not designed, had not anticipated, and could not fully control. He had decided that whoever George Bacon actually was, the offer he was building toward was preferable to the life he was living, not because the deception had worked perfectly, but because the reality underneath it was real enough. The operation had succeeded up to this point, not because Munir Redfei was fooled. It had succeeded because he had allowed himself to be approached. Those are not the same thing. And the difference meant that everything from this point forward, the family extraction, the flight, the future Mossad had promised him, would happen on terms that Redfei understood far more clearly than anyone in Tel Aviv was prepared to acknowledge. He was not being recruited. He was negotiating, and the 43 people who still lived in Baghdad had just become the only leverage in the room that actually mattered. The question George Bacon carried back to Tel Aviv was not operational. It was the question underneath the operation, the one nobody had asked at the beginning because the beginning always feels simpler than it is. What do you owe a man you befriended with a lie, when the lie is the only reason he trusts you enough to save his life? Nobody had an answer for that. The operation moved forward anyway. The family extraction plan, when it finally existed, was not elegant. It had been built in pieces over weeks by people who were working with incomplete information about Iraqi internal security, unreliable intelligence about Mukhabarat checkpoint patterns in northern Iraq, and a Kurdish network whose loyalty was genuine, but whose operational capacity had never been tested at this scale. 43 people. Staged departures, multiple cover stories, a timetable that could not slip because Redfei had been told the extraction would be complete before he flew, and if it wasn't complete, he wasn't flying. The plan had one structural weakness that everyone involved understood and nobody could fix. The family members themselves did not know they were being extracted. They knew they were leaving. They had been told, through Redfei and through quiet intermediaries, that there was a trip, a visit, a reason to go, reasons that varied by person and were carefully matched to what each individual would find plausible. An elderly relative who believed she was visiting family in another city, a younger cousin who believed he was attending to a business matter, Redfei's wife, who knew more than anyone else in the family and less than she would have needed to know to make genuinely informed choices. None of them knew the full picture. This was by design. A person who knows the full picture behaves differently from a person who believes they are doing something ordinary. And differently, at an Iraqi checkpoint in 1966, was a category of behavior that could get a family of 43 people arrested before sunset. The first stage of the extraction moved cleanly. A small group, the easiest to move, the ones with the most plausible reasons to travel, crossed through a Kurdish-controlled corridor in the north without incident. Contact on the other side confirmed their arrival. Tel Aviv received the report. The operation's temperature dropped slightly in the rooms where people had been holding their breath. This was the false release moment. And like all false release moments, it was expensive. The relative calm that followed the first successful extraction created a small but measurable shift in operational posture. Not carelessness. The people running this operation were not careless. But the specific quality of alertness that comes from pure uncertainty is different from the alertness that follows one confirmed success. Success, even partial success, teaches the wrong lesson. It suggests the plan is working. It suggests the model is accurate. It suggests the next stage will resemble the last. The next stage did not resemble the last. The second group was larger. It included Redfei's immediate family, his wife, his children, and several relatives whose movements would be more visible, more noticed, more likely to register with neighbors or colleagues or the low-level informant networks that the Mukhabarat maintained not through formal structure, but through the ordinary human tendency to report things that seem slightly wrong. One member of this group, a young man whose specific relationship to Redfei has never been publicly clarified, arrived at the designated departure point late. Not hours late. Late enough that the Kurdish guides, operating on a schedule built around checkpoint shift rotations that had been observed over weeks of prior intelligence, assessed that the window had closed. The guides wanted to abort the stage and reschedule. The Mossad coordinator on the ground, working through an intermediary because He could not physically be present at a Kurdish staging point in northern Iraq without destroying every cover in the operation simultaneously, had to make a decision without being able to see the situation he was deciding about. He said, "Wait." The guides waited. The young man arrived. The group moved. They were stopped at a checkpoint. The stop lasted 11 minutes. 11 minutes is not a long time by any normal measurement. Inside an operation where a single inconsistency in a single cover story could trigger a detention that would reach Baghdad within the hour, 11 minutes is a unit of time that does not reduce to seconds. It accumulates. The checkpoint soldier asked a question. The accounts of what he asked differ slightly in different tellings. Some say he asked about the destination. Some say he asked about the composition of the group, why so many people were traveling together at this hour. What every account agrees on is that the answer given was sufficient, and the group was waved through. Nobody in Tel Aviv knew about the 11 minutes until after it was over. The report came through clean, second stage complete. What the report did not include, because the coordinator on the ground judged it irrelevant once the group had passed, was which cover story had been used at the checkpoint. This omission would matter later, but at the time it registered as a detail in the category of operational noise, the kind of small adaptation that field operatives make constantly and that headquarters never needs to know about. The assumption was that the cover held because it was good. The actual reason the cover held was never verified. With the majority of the family out, the operation moved to its final stage, Redfay himself. He had been briefed on the flight profile in fragments, not in a single meeting. Single meetings were a security risk. In pieces, over multiple contacts, through a channel that used George Bacon only for the components that required the specific trust Bacon had spent 2 years building, and other intermediaries for the logistical details that didn't require that trust. The aircraft was to be fully fueled. The stated reason for the fuel request had been prepared, a cover reason, technically plausible, matched to a training exercise profile that would not trigger immediate scrutiny from ground crew. Redfa had flown enough sorties that his requests were not automatically unusual. He had, over the preceding months, been careful to maintain exactly the kind of unremarkable operational routine that would make a single deviation look like a routine deviation rather than a terminal one. This was the incorrect assumption playing out in real time. The assumption was that the full fuel request would pass unnoticed because Redfa's routine was clean. What nobody had modeled was the specific crew chief on duty that morning. The crew chief was not Mukhabarat. He was not a counterintelligence asset. He was an experienced ground technician who knew aircraft and knew pilots, and knew, from years of working the flight line, that a full fuel load on a training profile was the kind of thing that sometimes meant something, and sometimes meant a pilot had made an administrative error. He asked about it. Not formally, not in a way that required a report. He asked in the way that experienced technicians ask about things that don't quite fit. A sideways question, almost casual, directed at Redfa while the fueling was already underway. Redfa answered, "We do not know what he said. We know the crew chief accepted it, and the fueling continued. But there was a moment, not in any official record, reconstructed later from testimony, where Redfay did not answer immediately, where there was a pause that was slightly longer than the question required. A pilot who knows the correct technical answer to a question about his own sortie profile does not pause before giving it. The crew chief noticed the pause. He decided it meant nothing. This is the misjudgment that the operation depended on and that no one in Tel Aviv could have planned for. Not Mossad's preparation, not Redfa's composure, not the cover story. The operation proceeded because one man, doing his job with professional thoroughness, looked at an anomaly and concluded it was within the acceptable range of human behavior on an ordinary morning. He was right, and he was wrong, and there was no version of the plan that could control which conclusion he reached. Redfay completed pre-flight, taxied to the runway, received clearance. There was one more thing that happened before the throttle went forward, one detail that surfaces in later accounts and that tends to get omitted because it complicates the clean arc of the story. Redfay, in the final moments before takeoff, experienced something that he described years later not as doubt. He was past doubt, but as a specific physical recognition that the life he was about to leave was ending. Not the bad parts of it, not the discrimination and the bombing missions and the professional ceilings, the whole thing. The language he dreamed in, the city he knew by smell, the people whose faces he would not see again. It settled on him the way things settle on a person when there is no longer any point in not feeling them. He released the brakes. The MiG-21 accelerated down the runway. And the thing that nobody in the operation, not Bacon, not Amit, not Helms in Washington had ever needed to consider became suddenly, briefly visible. Munir Redfa was not defecting from Iraq because Mossad had built a perfect operation. He was defecting because he had decided to. The operation had provided the mechanism. The permission had always been his own. Whether that distinction would matter to anyone but him was a question that had no useful answer at 10,000 feet and climbing. The MiG-21 touched down at Ramat David Air Base in northern Israel at approximately 10:30 in the morning on August 16, 1966. The aircraft was intact. The pilot was alive. The operation, by every measurable standard of intelligence tradecraft, had succeeded, and within 48 hours, the consequences of how it had succeeded began to arrive. The first consequence was not strategic, it was human, and it preceded any formal celebration. Redfa's wife, already extracted and resettled, was told by her Mossad handlers that her husband had landed safely. She received this information in a location she had not chosen, in a country she had not selected, surrounded by people whose language she did not speak. The relief she felt and the loss she felt occupied the same moment. There was no way to separate them. The handlers noted her response and moved to the next item on their list. Redfa himself was debriefed before he had slept. This is standard procedure. Memory degrades, details soften, and the first hours after an operation are the richest intelligence window available. He answered questions for hours. He described the MiG-21 systems in the precise technical language of a man who had flown the aircraft dozens of times and knew it the way a person knows a tool they have trusted with their life. He was professional. He was thorough. At some point during the debrief, he asked about his family. He was told they were safe. He asked where. He was given a partial answer. He did not ask again. He understood by then what partial answers meant in the world he had entered. In Baghdad, the disappearance of Munir Redfa's MiG-21 from radar was initially categorized as a possible accident, a crash over unpopulated terrain, a technical failure. The Iraqi Air Force's first response was search and rescue, not counterintelligence, which meant the first several hours were spent looking for wreckage rather than sealing borders or arresting family members. This delay was not planned by Mossad. It was a function of Iraqi institutional assumption, the belief that a Christian pilot from a minority community, however disgruntled, would not have the specific kind of audacity that the actual event required. The Mukhabarat's initial counterintelligence assessment, reconstructed later, assumed pilot error or mechanical failure, because deliberate defection to Israel was, in the operational imagination of Iraqi intelligence, a category of event too extreme to be the first hypothesis. By the time the correct conclusion was reached, the family was gone. The window for the most immediate form of reprisal had closed, but the investigation that followed was not gentle, and it did not stop at the immediate family. Extended relatives, neighbors, colleagues, anyone in Redfa's professional and social network became subjects of an inquiry that lasted years and destroyed careers, livelihoods, and in some cases, lives of people who had known nothing and done nothing and had simply been adjacent to a man who had made a decision they were not told about. This is the cost that the operation's architecture made inevitable. 43 people were saved. The number of people who paid for their salvation was never counted. The crew chief who had noticed the pause, the man who had asked a sideways question about the fuel load and accepted the answer, was interviewed. He was interviewed multiple times, over multiple years. He lost his position. The Iraqi military's internal logic held that a crew chief who had been present at the moment of a defection and had not acted was either complicit or incompetent, and the system did not extend much operational distinction between those two categories. He had made a reasonable judgment on an ordinary morning. The consequences of that judgment were not ordinary. This is the thread that connects back to the decision Mayor Amit made in Tel Aviv, the decision to continue rather than abort when the operation's security was uncertain. Amit was right that there would be no second access point. He was also right in the way that decision-makers are always right when the outcome justifies the risk, and the people who paid the cost of being right are not in the room when the accounting is done. The MiG-21, designated 007 by the Israelis with an informality that barely concealed the magnitude of what it represented, was taken apart with the systematic care of people who understood that every component was a question with a precise answer they had never had before. The radar, the weapons systems, the engine performance envelope at altitude and at low speed, the specific angles and approaches where the aircraft was most vulnerable, the cockpit layout, the instrumentation, the ejection system. Israeli engineers and Air Force technicians documented everything with the thoroughness of people who knew that somewhere in these measurements was the information that would decide air battles not yet fought. 8 months later, in June 1967, the Israeli Air Force destroyed the combined Arab air forces in a single morning. The operation took approximately 3 hours. Aircraft from Egypt, Syria, and Jordan were caught on the ground, or were engaged and destroyed in the air by pilots who had spent the preceding months training against the specific vulnerabilities that 007 had revealed. The victory was not solely attributable to the MiG-21. Nothing in warfare is solely attributable to a single intelligence asset. But the knowledge gap that had kept Israeli Air Force commanders awake in 1963 had been closed, and closed precisely, not approximately, not theoretically, but with the granular technical certainty that only comes from having the actual aircraft in a hangar. The Americans received 007 as promised. Project Have Donut, the classified program under which U.S. Air Force and Navy pilots flew the aircraft against their own fighters, produced findings that were not comfortable reading for the Pentagon. The MiG-21 was faster than expected in certain performance envelopes. Its radar was different from what U.S. pilots had been trained to counter. The tactics American pilots had been developing based on estimated capabilities were, in several specific and critical areas, wrong. The corrective program that followed became the U.S. Navy Fighter Weapons School. The school trained fighter pilots in dissimilar air combat, the art of fighting an aircraft that flies differently from anything in your own inventory. The graduates of that school flew over Vietnam against the same aircraft, operated by North Vietnamese pilots trained by Soviet instructors, and they survived engagements that earlier pilots had not survived. The lineage from a park bench in Paris to a checkpoint in northern Iraq, to a runway at Ramat David to an airfield in San Diego is not a straight line. History never moves in straight lines. But the connection is real, documented and permanent in the record of the Cold War. Munir Redfa was resettled in Israel. He flew for the Israeli Air Force for a period. He received the money that had been deposited in Switzerland. His family was housed and provided for. His identity was classified for years. He could not tell people his real name or his real history. He lived as a person officially without a past, which is a workable condition for an intelligence asset and a very difficult condition for a human being trying to construct an ordinary life. The country he had grown up in, the streets and smells and sounds that formed the background of everything he understood as normal, were permanently inaccessible. Not because he was prevented from returning would have been fatal, but because the Iraq he had known had been reorganized around his absence. The architecture of a life cannot be stored and retrieved. It exists in the present tense or it does not exist. He gave interviews in his later years that were cautious and carefully bounded. He spoke about the aircraft with the warmth that pilots reserve for machines they have trusted. He spoke about his family's safety with evident relief. He did not speak with ease about what the operation had cost him that could not be itemized. He died in 1998. Israel acknowledged his role publicly only after his death, which is the intelligence world's version of a debt paid in the currency of a man who can no longer receive it. George Bacon's real name has never been officially confirmed. The man who spent years becoming someone's trusted friend under a name that wasn't his returned to a life that the operation's record does not illuminate. This is intentional. The cover that protected him during the operation became, in a different sense, the cover that persists now. Some identities once assumed are never fully shed. 007 sits today at the Israeli Air Force Museum in Hatzerim, in the Negev Desert. It is painted in the markings it wore when it landed. Visitors photograph it. Children point at it. Tour guides explain what it is and roughly how it came to be there. They do not explain the crew chief who lost his career on an ordinary morning. They do not explain the 43 extractions, or the 100-odd relatives who were not extracted. They do not explain what George Bacon said to Munir Redfay the last time they spoke as something resembling friends. These are the parts of the story that the aircraft cannot tell. If this operation raises questions for you about the machinery behind intelligence history, the people, the decisions, the costs that never make the official record, this channel exists for exactly that reason. Subscribe. The next operation is already waiting.